All right, well, the first question we're going to talk about today is what is RPE? And you may have saw this on social media or heard someone talk about it, but RPE stands for rating of perceived exertion. And essentially all it means is how hard you feel like you're working out. It all started back with the Borg scale. This kind of starts with our cardiovascular based training in the research setting. There's a scale from 6 to 20. 6 means, hey, I'm doing pretty much nothing, whereas 20 means, hey, this is as hard as I can go. And from there, you're kind of grading, saying, hey, how hard am I working? And so people say, hey, I'm doing about 12 to 14. That's moderately, challenging for people. Whereas when we start getting up to, 20, obviously it's super, super challenging. But this is kind of the first start we had into this whole concept of, how can we rate how hard we're working? When you're working, are you just barely breaking a sweat, kind of on the lower end of things, or are you, almost dying? That's on the far end of things. And so the reason that it's 6 to 20 initially is actually has a really good correlation with heart rate when you multiply by 10. And so, it might not seem very intuitive, like, well, why don't they just choose 1 to 10? But 6 to 20 actually had a purpose for it because you can use that. If you're saying, hey, I'm at a 7, you multiply that by 10, then you have a pretty decent estimation of what your heart rate is expected to be. And it's been shown in a couple of studies that is a decent indicator for it, but we don't really use it as much in the general population for things. But from a research-based perspective, it's kind of nice to see, how close someone's getting. When they say they're at this spot and they compare it to what they actually are on the heart rate monitor, it's kind of cool to see. But that's kind of the initial RP, the 6 to 20, and then it's kind of been tweaked from there. There's another one called the Omni, and essentially that's usually 1 to 10. And I think this is the one most people see when you're looking at social media or hear people talking about it. And that's the one I use, in terms of going on 1 to 10. 1 meaning like, hey, I could do this all day, and once again, 10's like, max effort thing we can do there. And, that's another way of kind of, once again, just a little more intuitive, saying, hey, minimal effort to max effort, we can kind of go from there. The hardest thing that we can possibly do is a 10, and 1 is just kind of easy. So it kind of gives us a base of saying, hey, this is how hard I think I'm working. And it kind of gives us a nice, baseline of saying, hey, this is what I think I'm at, and then we can kind of adjust things from there. Okay, so maybe your question is, okay, well, what's the purpose of this? How do I use it? Well, there's a couple things that we can do for it. First, we can kind of auto-regulate with this. What I mean by auto-regulate is kind of day-to-day, you go to the gym and you're going to feel a little different, right? You don't go to the gym every single day and say, man, I feel great. I'm ready to go. I'm going to max out every single day. That doesn't happen. So with RP, what's really cool is you can, have a set RPE for your workout and kind of base the weights off of that. So let's say, hey, I'm doing some back squats today, 3 by 5, and it's supposed to be an RPE of 8. And let's say, I'm feeling really good and it's, 300 pounds or whatnot. Let's just say that number. And then the next day I'm supposed to do 3 by 5 again, RPE 8, but I'm feeling awful and I can only get 255. It's still an RPE of 8 because you're perceiving that it's really challenging. It's at that 8 level, but it's not where you were before. And so it kind of helps auto-regulate that. That means, I kind of like that because if you go to a day where you're not feeling so hot, it doesn't mean you have to just go grind through to get a specific number. You can kind of scale, back appropriately and kind of still give your body the appropriate stimulus, but not too much stimulus. So that's really nice in from that regard. And typically a lot of times it kind of helps you move forward in the longer term, in terms of gives you an intensity goal for the day. Say, hey, my goal is to work up to some heavy singles at RPE 9, which means, hey, they're pretty darn hard, but I'm not maxing out all the way. Or you can say, hey, this exercise today, RPE 7, I want to leave a little bit in the tank. I want it to be challenging, but not too bad. So it kind of can give us a good goal for intensity and then can also kind of help auto-regulate the day. Another question people have is, well, is reps in reserve the same as RP? And although technically no, they're pretty much used interchangeably. And what reps in reserve means essentially how many reps you feel like you had left after a certain set. So let's say you're just grinding out bench press. You feel like you could have done maybe 1 more rep. Well, that's a rep in reserve RIR of 1. So I'm saying you have 1 single rep left. Now you back it down, you say 2 more, that's RIR 2. And so you'll notice that RIR and RPE are inversely related. So obviously the higher the RPE, the lower the RIR. What that means is the higher RPE, which means the higher, perceived exertion. So the harder you're working, the fewer reps you can do. So the lower RIR. It's kind of interesting there. So they do not go hand in hand. As one goes up, the other goes up. Actually, as one goes up, the other goes down, which is interesting enough. But you can use this pretty much in the same way as RP. You can say, hey, on my squat today, I want to go RIR 3, meaning I got 3 left in the tank. And you can kind of use that like RP. It's very similar. It's just another way that some people find is a little more intuitive because if, an RP of 7 or 8, well, what does that mean? Whereas RIR is like, oh, okay, actually, I think I could do 2 more. I don't think I could do any more than that. It kind of gives you a nice baseline. So some people are really, really good at RPE based on how they feel in their body. Other people like RIR. It's really, up to you. But essentially what these tools are is to help us auto-regulate our programming. Okay, so you might be asking, cool, that's great. What about this academic nonsense? How does it use practically? Well, for me, most of my strength components the first hour of the day, I use some sort of RPE scale. So essentially, RPE 7, 8, 9, something like that. And it kind of gives me some guides for the day for my strength training. I go in there and make sure I'm not, going too crazy or going too light. I want to make sure I have an appropriate stimulus. So for me, it's usually like the first thing I do for strength is something, RPE around 7 to 9 to kind of make sure I'm getting a good stimulus. And the reason I do that too is make sure that we're kind of getting the reps that we need to, right? So for hypertrophy or for strength, we want to make sure we're having quality reps. If you're just repping out things all day and it's not challenging, well, that's not going to induce any changes in terms of strength or hypertrophy. And if you're going to max out every single day, that's probably not as ideal, and you're going to have a lot of fatigue there as well. So it kind of helps guide me for my effort for the day, and also making sure I'm hitting quality reps for hypertrophy and strength. I also like this so much because it helps me adjust for good or bad days. Like I said, if I'm feeling good and I want to keep going up, I can do that. If the weight's moving fast and it feels really easy, I can move up that weight and kind of get the appropriate stimulus for the day. Whereas, when you have just a regular program that's based off percentage, you just say, okay, I'm supposed to do, this weight today, and it feels super easy, but I guess that's it. I'm done for the day. And so what's nice about this is you can kind of auto-regulate to there. And for me, it's honestly more important to do it the other way. Whereas you're just grinding out something that shouldn't be grinding out, you can kind of scale back from there. So that's super helpful, but it does take time to get used to. I said it's very challenging. There's studies showing that people who don't do this and don't practice it aren't very good at guessing. So if you just take someone off the street and say, hey, do an RPE of 7, they're going to have no idea, what does it look like. So this takes a lot of time of lifting quite frequently, kind of getting exposure to that, and honestly using some heavy weights, because you're not going to really know what it feels like to have, an RIR of 1, like 1 left in the tank, unless you're doing some heavy weights. And so it just takes a little time. But that being said, I encourage you to start doing it. Try it and see, hey, what does this feel like? Where am I at? Because the more you practice, the better you get it. And I think it's a really, really good tool that we can have in our tool belt to kind of help us, like I said, auto-regulate our day and help us make gains later down the line.